I'm Jan Dezard. I teach environmental studies and sociology here at the college, and it has been my pleasure for the last day and a half to preside over, very loosely speaking, preside over a wonderfully stimulating colloquy between our two speakers this afternoon, Bill McKibben and Governor Christy Todd Whitman. Yesterday, Bill McKibben summarized briefly for us the circumstances that we face and how he thinks we not only ought to, but need to respond. And Governor Whitman will follow up following him and give us her view of, shall I say, what we need to do, what is to be done. Presentations will be between 10 and 15 minutes. And then we will throw the floor open for comments and questions and colloquy between our two guests. By way of introduction, Bill McKibben, as I'm sure many of you know, is the author of numerous books and articles, not all of them on environmental matters, but many of them indeed devoted to helping us understand what human beings are doing to the world and how the Earth is, in fact, responding to what we are doing. He was the first to call our attention in 1989 in his book, The End of Nature, to what we were doing to the atmosphere. 2 decades before, Rachel Carson had done the same thing, issuing clarion calls to wake up the nation to what we were doing to our soils and water with the chemical fertilizers and pesticides and so on that we were just wildly applying. But in terms of raising public consciousness about what we were doing to the atmosphere and what consequences would follow from that, Bill McKibben's End of Nature was the first that really captured the public imagination. And indeed, he has stayed with this topic with the publication of numerous books, which I won't here summarize. You can go on Amazon and find them all, or go to the local bookseller, even better. And if they don't have them in stock, they will be happy to order them. Bill is a scholar in residence at Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont. And for the past several years, he has gone from writing eloquently about the perils we face in terms of global warming and climate change to organizing in fact, the largest demonstration to date in behalf of getting control over carbon. He has founded, along with a number of students from Middlebury College, an organization which I'm sure he will speak briefly to, and you will hear more of in the coming months. The organization is really easy to remember. It is 350.org, 350 being that concentration of carbon per parts per million in the atmosphere that scientists now think is the maximum tolerable level that we can stand and sustain a livable climate for ourselves and for the creatures with whom we share the planet. Governor Christy Todd Whitman, as I'm sure you know, was governor in New Jersey from 1994 to 2001, when she was then appointed by President George W. Bush to head up the EPA, which she did admirably from 2001 to 2003. As governor of New Jersey, she made enormous strides and in fact got many recognition and notices from prominent environmental groups for her work on the environment. She preserved a record amount of New Jersey land as permanent green space. She was recognized as well for instituting the most comprehensive beach monitoring system in the nation. And as EPA administrator, she promoted watershed-based protection policies, championed regulations to deal with the non-vehicular off-road diesel engines and reduce sulfur emissions by 95% therein. In addition, she established, and I think this is really important to all of us, the first federal program to promote redevelopment and reuse of brownfields, those industrial sites that had been despoiled. They will, as I say, speak in turn, and we will begin with you, Bill.
Well, Jan, thank you, and thank you for your hospitality all week. I'm very talked out, and in any event, for me to even try to figure out how I'm going to say all this in 10 minutes is a virtually impossible
you can have 15.
task
Go ahead.
for someone as verbose as me. So I'm actually, what I'm going to do is dispense with courtesies of any kind, and apologize in advance for being a little gruff and a little tough on y'all. I'm going to give you some bad news, and then I'm going to give you some sort of mixed news, okay? And the bad news is all about where we are right now with climate. What I've been talking with students here about in the last couple of days, in part, is the fact that our understanding of this problem of global warming has shifted significantly in the last 18 months or so. Having written the first book on all of this 20 years ago, I've followed the scientific developments for a very long time and know all the players and so on. People who had been concerned and sober and alarmed all along, suddenly about 18 months ago began to sound panicked when I talked to them on the phone or saw them in their offices, the cutting-edge scientists about all this, and here's why. It's become extraordinarily clear that all of a sudden global warming is happening more quickly and more comprehensively than we thought it would. A series of very large-scale feedback loops have begun to kick in and accelerate the warming that we have kicked off by burning as much coal and gas and oil as we have. So I'm going to assume that you all have the sort of basic understanding about how climate change works and all of that, and just tell you, sort of where we are at the moment. You'll remember that in the summer of 2007, we saw the sudden and dramatic melt of Arctic ice, 50 years ahead of what most of the computer forecast would have had it. That was very bad news, not only for proof of how quickly things were warming, but also because it's itself an accelerant of this process. You remove the nice white ice that acts as a mirror and reflects the sun's rays back out to space and replace it with an absorbing blue ocean. Everything else frozen on Earth is melting very quickly. We're seeing destabilization that we hadn't expected on the great ice sheets above Greenland and the West Antarctic that control, for the most part, the world's sea levels. At least as dangerously, we're seeing extremely rapid, much more rapid than we'd anticipated, melt in the glaciers, in the Himalayas and the Andes. These are not huge extents of ice, okay? They're 1% or less of the ice on Earth. But they're incredibly important. The glaciers in the Himalayas alone, in an area roughly the size of Italy, provide the headwaters of the Ganges, the Yellow, the Yangtze, the Brahmaputra, the Salween, and the Mekong. So a third of humanity lives downstream from those rivers, and they live downstream from them because those glaciers are there, assuring a year-round supply of water. It's one of the best features of the Holocene Earth on which we've developed. It was warm enough that we didn't have ice covering our continental interiors, but cold enough that we had this nifty method for storing water in these glacial caps, and there's no plan B for what we do once that runs out. And we're not talking, we're scarcely talking decades in some of these cases. I mean, this is happening with enormous rapidity. There are a series of other changes of just as large magnitude underway. The data becomes clearer with each passing week. We see enormous disruptions in hydrological cycles. Because warm air holds more water vapor than cold, we see tremendous increases in evaporation. The USGS said earlier this year that we can now expect, in essence, a permanent drought across the American Southwest. They no longer expect that Lake Powell behind Glen Canyon will ever fill again, okay? The rates of stream flow are small enough and evaporation high enough that Colorado system on which much of the West depends is no longer viable in the way that it has been in the past. The Australian Meteorological Office said late last year that they were no longer going to use the word drought to describe what's going on in Australia. The Murray-Darling River Basin, the center of Australian agriculture, has seen productivity shrink dramatically because there's been no rainfall. What the Meteorological Office said is that calling it drought implies that it will end. We believe this is the new permanent condition for this part of the world. The same sort of thing happening across the planet. As all that water goes up into the atmosphere, it's going to come down someplace, and hence we see dramatic increase in serious rainstorm and flood in moist places around the world. Recent estimates are that over the ocean, we've seen an increase in thunderclouds of as much as 40% in the last 20 years. There's new data out a couple of weeks ago on lightning strikes around the world, indicating that there's 6% more of them annually than there were not too many years ago. Those are very large changes in very basic phenomenon in a very short period of time. The oceans themselves have been dramatically affected in ways that we could not have expected even a few years ago. People were, frankly, completely surprised by the pace with which the oceans are acidifying as they assimilate carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The pH of oceans has changed in the last 30 years from 8.2 to 8.1. That's a large change. It may be large enough to show up on that little strip of paper that you dip in your hot tub, to check its alkalinity. It's certainly big enough to have begun to affect the ability of marine creatures to do their thing, form shells, stuff like that. The storms that arise in those oceans are clearly larger. If not, it's a little unclear whether they're more frequent, but they're definitely larger than we have seen in the past, which makes sense because the warmth of the tropical ocean presents the upper boundary for the energy that hurricanes and cyclones draw from. And so we see tremendous increases in the destructive capacity of those storms. If you don't want to believe the scientific results, then turn to the spreadsheets of all the world's major insurers who are very clear that the rate of payout on coastal properties, indeed properties of all kinds around the world, is rising exponentially as we destabilize climate. The point I'm trying to make is that we have much less room to maneuver than we thought we did, partly because as these things happen, they begin to kick off feedback loops over which we have no control. In 2007, there was a dramatic spike in the amount of methane flowing into the atmosphere. It's not coming directly from human beings. It appears to be coming from beneath the permafrost of the far north and from underwater methane clathrates in oceans now warm enough for those to begin to melt. We set the process off. We burned enough carbon to warm the temperature to melt those things, okay? And so indirectly we're responsible, but we can't turn it off. Even if we stop driving our cars, that will continue. We have to very quickly check our contribution to all of this so that we keep those feedback loops from getting entirely out of control. We now have a number for all of this. It's the number that Jan alluded to. It's the most important number on Earth. It's 350 parts per million CO2. Jim Hansen of NASA, our greatest climatologist, and his team announced this number a year ago, saying in the abstract of their scientific paper that any value for CO2 above 350 parts per million was not compatible with the planet upon which our civilization developed or to which life on Earth is adapted. It's a very tough number because we're already past it. We're at 387 parts per million and rising 2 parts per million annually. We are akin to the person who goes to the doctor and the doctor says, "Sir, your cholesterol is too high. You got to bring it down because you're in that zone where otherwise you're going to have the heart attack or the stroke." We are beginning to have the heart attacks and the strokes. That's what the melt of Arctic ice is. There are many other thresholds out there that we're getting very near. Melt of glacial ice, shifting of monsoonal rain patterns, on and on and on. Okay? That 350 number now presents for the first time a real target for human beings to aim for. It is an exceptionally difficult target to aim at, and I will not in any way pretend that it isn't. What Hansen's team said was we would need to stop burning coal by 2030 on this planet and considerably earlier in the developed world. If we don't, we'll put too much carbon into the atmosphere to ever get back to that number. If we are able to rein ourselves in very quickly, then it's at least possible, hopeful, that the Earth's absorptive capacity, forests, oceans, will be able to soak up enough of that CO2 to get us back someplace in the direction of the right number by the time that the youngest students at Amherst are elderly. Okay? That's the task for our time. Now I want to talk in the couple of minutes that I have left about, and this is the mixed news, okay? The mixed news is that maybe we can do something about it, but if we're going to do anything about it, you're going to have to do it, okay? And this is the gruff part of this talk, all right? Political conditions as they exist at the moment in this country and around this world do not allow for the shift in time to do what we need to do. The political reality of the moment, as Governor Whitman very ably pointed out in the course of her remarks this morning, doesn't allow that kind of shift in the time that we need, okay? That means that we need to change that political reality. We need to change it because we're not going to change the physical reality. Chemistry and physics don't bargain, they don't negotiate, they don't compromise, they don't wait for a more convenient hour, okay? In order to change that, we need to build the kind of movement that we have not built in the past. Not a movement to change light bulbs in one town or another, not a movement to build more environmental organizations to send out more fundraising appeals, a movement to build a real movement, okay? We've done it to some extent in this country already. 2 years ago, with a group of undergraduates, we formed this thing called Step It Up, and with the help of people in this room, organized 1,400 simultaneous demonstrations around the country with the same demand to cut carbon emissions 80%. It was successful. Both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton changed their energy policies within days of the conclusion of that round of rallies to reflect precisely the demand that we'd made, and we're beginning to see the very fruitful results of that in the Obama administration. Nothing great has happened yet, but we've certainly laid the groundwork. More good has happened on global warming in the last 2 weeks of the Obama administration than in the previous 20 years of American presidencies, okay? We need to do the same thing on a much larger scale around the globe. That's why we've formed this organization called 350.org, 350.org. Its only goal is to spread that number around the world in the course of the next year before international negotiations at Copenhagen that represent the last plausible chance we have to really shift course in time to make a significant difference. We already have had considerable success in getting that number out into the discourse. Al Gore has now adopted it as the framework that he uses when he speaks about climate. John Kerry, your senator, did a terrific job in his last week in the Senate questioning Gore of making a very strong point about how important that number was. If you happen to be on the list of people that we asked to call Senator Kerry to make sure he did that, then I'm grateful to you for doing that. It was very effective. What we're aiming for is a huge international day of action on the 24th of October of this year. There will be actions in every part of the world, high in the Himalayas. There'll be climbers and 350 scuba divers underwater on the Great Barrier Reef, thousands and thousands of actions going on in every corner of the world. We have offices up and running, mostly staffed by young people, in San Francisco, in Budapest, in Berlin, in Johannesburg, in Beirut, in Ecuador, in Delhi. Okay? But we have very little money, and we have very little time, and we cannot organize this for you. Organizing the world turns out to be a large challenge. The world turns out to be a large place. People in this room need to take care of doing this in the Pioneer Valley for us on October 24th. So talk amongst yourselves and figure out who's going to take the lead and how it's going to happen. We will help you all we can. Be in touch with us. We've got materials, so on and so forth. But we need a couple of really spectacular things out of this part of the world that will make it into the Globe and onto the front page of the other newspapers and under the TV, and things that will really help make, by October 25th, this the most well-known number on Earth, not just the most important. It is something of a long shot, okay, this strategy. But there is no other shot at the moment in play. 6 weeks after that date in Copenhagen, the world's leaders will meet to find a successor to the Kyoto Treaty. We can't have them able to simply come out of the room and say, well, we've reached an agreement of some kind. We need them to know that the question that they'll be asked is, did the agreement you reach actually accomplish the goal of moving the Earth back towards the direction where science tells us it has some chance of stability? If they can't answer that, then the agreement is worse than nothing, because it'll lock us in to a future otherwise. We need that political movement. We need it in the next 10 months. That means I apologize for making this moral claim on you. We need your help, and we need it now. Thank you.
Governor Whitman.
Well, I think the question, when you listen to Bill and to the science, is why do we even have to have this kind of a discussion today? Why isn't everybody already aware of this? Why aren't we already mobilized? Why aren't we doing things about this particular issue? And let me just put a little perspective around it so we understand, because frankly, they're not all wackos, the people who don't believe that we need to take dramatic action. They're not all crazy or ignorant. It was as recently, and in geophysics and science, it's pretty recent, as 1974 and 75, that Time magazine and Newsweek were opining about the potential cataclysmic effects of global climate change. And what they were talking about, and they said man may be part of this, but what they were talking about was freezing. They were talking about the average summer day being like a day today here. So for those people who still have questions, and I am not among them, but there are, that's one of the ways they're looking at it. The other is that I think that we have been, those of us who are involved in, or care about this issue, have allowed language to actually thwart us in many ways. One is we keep talking about global warming. That's correct. That's actually what's happening. But again, when you come from parts of the country that are suddenly seeing some of the coldest weather they've ever had, you open the gate for them, the ones who don't want to believe, to say, well, what are you talking about? You're crazy. We've just had the coldest weather we've ever enjoyed for the last week. This is global warming. That's why I'm always very careful to say climate change. Now, scientists and purists don't like that because that's not really what's happening, but my desire always is to get as many people involved as we possibly can. And the other sort of broad statement that gets made that I think causes people to stop and gives an opening to those who don't want to believe is when we say man causes climate change. The globe has been changing since it was formed. I mean, we did have ice ages, and we weren't around to muck that up. They went away. We didn't cause that. So what we really should be saying is man is so exacerbating a natural trend that nature can no longer absorb it in the way that it has and acclimate, and we can't either. We are facing potential problems that are enormous, and we're not prepared to deal with them because they're coming at us so fast. We really need to stop and think about what it is and how we're talking about it. What Bill is proposing is something that I believe is really probably the only way we can get things done today. I mean, if you think about it, the modern day environmental movement started with one woman in a book. It was Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring. And it was right after Earth Day that President Nixon signed legislation establishing the Environmental Protection Agency. And we went into that enormously productive bipartisan period from 1970 to 1990, where we enacted just about every major piece of legislation and regulation that protects our environment today. We need to get back to that. But the reason we were able to have that productive period of bipartisan action was because the people had spoken up, because you had people standing, holding hands around this country on Earth Day. You had people out acting, being activists on Earth Day. They were people who were communicating to their elected representatives that this is a serious issue and we want to see some action on it. We've fallen away from that. And part of those reasons, I will also say, is because for some, the idea of how dramatic the potential adverse consequences are scares people to death. And they say, I can't do anything about that. The world's going to come to, what am I going to be able to do? How is this going to affect anything? And frankly, I got to worry about whether I can afford the mortgage. I have to worry about whether I'm going to be able to get my medicines or my children going to get a decent education. And that's what I better concentrate on, because this is much too big for me. It's much too complicated. There's still scientists out there who will tell you that we're looking at the wrong things. And I did something again we mentioned earlier today, and in point of fact, if we really want to deal with the issue of climate change, we can't just talk about emissions. They're enormously important. They're easy to quantify and to do something about: carbon concentration, carbon emissions, because we know where it's coming from pretty much, although a trading system is going to be difficult to implement. But as I had mentioned earlier, there's a NASA study of about 8 years ago now that said over the past 300 years, we would have had to double the amount of carbon emitted into the atmosphere to have the same impact on climate change that has occurred because of land use changes, deforestation, farming practices, and development. Yet we never talk about that when we talk about climate change. And if we're truly going to meet this problem, we need to take action now on the things that everyone is willing to accept as having an impact, which is air emissions. But we cannot forget that we also need to be addressing smart growth and land use and the interrelationship between these two things. We have big challenges ahead, but we also have to break it down, I believe, so that people and individuals feel that it is doable, that we can do something about it, that it's not the end of the world, it's not too late. We have scientific reporting now that we basically are almost there. The tipping point has happened and there's nothing that we can do about it. And I think that's a shame, because it's a fine balance we have to find. We have to get to that point where people are concerned enough about this to put the pressure on their elected officials to do something about it and start taking the actions now that will prevent further degradation. At the same time, we don't want to tell them that it's impossible to get anything done, that this is so critical and so bad now that it gives them an excuse to walk away. Because there's so much going on in people's lives, particularly in today's economic climate, that it's going to be very easy for people to get distracted and to look elsewhere. And that balance is very hard to achieve. We do have an administration now that is committed. And we have an administration that has held out for an 80% reduction of 1990 levels of emissions by 2050. So we have a real commitment. Now, whether that timetable is going to hold given current economic realities or not, I don't know. But we have to be there to give those who want to talk about it the political maneuver room to take action and to say, yes, this is what people really want. And in spite of the economic crisis we face today, it's not an excuse for doing nothing. In fact, we need to continue to move forward and look for creative ways that we can tell people you can do something about it. What Bill's talking about is one way. I will catch him up a little bit because he always says it's not one light bulb at a time, but you know what? It makes a difference. The cumulative individual action really does have an impact. And I say that because a longtime champion of the Energy Star program, and taking a look back over the year 2007, because they haven't done their numbers for 2008 yet, but the purchase of Energy Star products by consumers, a purely voluntary program, reduced the greenhouse gas equivalent of taking 27 million cars, it is, off the road. So that's real, and that's individual action. So we can act individually to make a difference, but that's not enough. We must, I believe, have a mandatory cap on carbon. It's the only way we are going to get everybody involved in this from the economic sector, and it's also the only way we can then look at the rest of the world, meaning particularly the developing countries of China and India, and say, you've got to do something too. But I don't believe we have the moral stature to be able to say that today, not having taken mandatory action. It's going to be difficult because the devil is always in the details, and how you get to the targets that are going to make sense are going to be very hard. Again, economics plays a real role here, and we have an interesting setup situation in Washington in the administration with Larry Summers on the one hand, who doesn't really believe much in climate change or the need to take drastic action, and Dr. Cho in energy, who clearly believes in it strongly, and Carol Browner is the energy czar, who is very strong, and Lisa Jackson at EPA is also a firm believer. So it's going to be an interesting dynamic, and you have a lot of players in it. But at least we are going to see action. The potential is there to make a difference. I just don't want people to think that this is such a big, cataclysmic event coming at us so fast that we have no potential to push back. I don't believe we're going to stop climate change. Again, because I believe that the climate and the earth has been changing forever, and that's man's arrogance that can say we can stop it. But we can and must slow it down. And to the extent we can reverse it, that would be a very good thing. But we need to put it in perspective and in a language that people can understand so we can get the kind of buy-in that will allow people to be willing to make the kind of sacrifices that are going to have to be made. Because there will be sacrifices, there will be costs attached to this, without question. To meet the kinds of challenges we have, it's going to cost us more, and we have to be willing to pay that price. It's going to be finding the balance that allows people to continue to make a living while doing it that is going to prove the real challenge. But we won't even begin to have that serious discussion if we haven't put the kind of pressure on our elected leaders that lets them know that this is something we take seriously and we want them to address. With that, I'll stop and we'll enter into discussion.
As promised, the floor is open. Let's go.
Okay. To use maybe an apt analogy, I think we're talking about turning a supertanker. What I see in the news about adaptation to climate change is all about mostly small developing countries that are facing flooding or having to relocate populations. But it occurs to me that I don't hear a lot about what we here in the developed world are going to have to do to adapt to the climate change that is happening and is going to happen even if we do the right things and eventually get the carbon dioxide levels down. Also, I don't know to what extent anyone is talking about the adaptations that we're going to do as being due to climate change as opposed to all the other factors that might be coming up. And the obvious one is what's going to happen with insurance rates. So I wonder if either of you would like to talk to both the question
Sure.
of adaptation and about labeling the adaptation for what it is.
Sure. Those are very good questions. We used to talk, people still do talk about, divide this problem into two parts. One is mitigation and one is adaptation. Mitigation being slowing the flow of carbon into the atmosphere, and adapting being what we're going to do with what we can't prevent, which we obviously have to do something about. But the burden of the last 18 months of this new science, okay, is in a sense to focus everybody back hard on mitigation, on stopping the flow of carbon into the atmosphere, because it's becoming clear that if we don't, the scale of change that's coming at us is beyond our ability to adapt to. Governor Whitman and I were just looking at a speech that Stephen Chu, the new Secretary of Energy, gave today in Los Angeles, okay? And in it, he was talking about what would happen in California as the snowpack, as computer modeling universally shows will happen without major change, if the snowpack melted, and what he was in the Sierra if it wasn't there seasonally. And what he said was, and remember, this is the Secretary of Energy, speaking. He said, well, by the latter part of the century, it may not be possible to have agriculture in California, and I don't think you're going to be able to live in the cities here either. Okay? There's not enough money in the world to adapt to change on that scale, all right? If we're now plausibly talking not about 1 or 2 feet of sea level rise this century, but perhaps 6 or 7 feet. That makes every coastal city look like New Orleans. There's not enough money to do it. And the insurance, you're very right to talk about the way that insurance is one of the ways that will kind of tell this in a sense. Swiss Re, the biggest insurance company in the world, and the Harvard did a study last year where they tried to look at what was going to happen in the Gulf Coast as storms became more frequent. They used that as a kind of template for what would go on around the world. And their conclusion was it was in the very bland language used by insurers and Harvard professors. But it said due to the abbreviated return time of events, that is, due to the fact that, for instance, this year there were, Cuba and Haiti were each hit by 5 hurricanes in a row. So if it hit, the Louisiana State, due to the abbreviated return time of events, it appears likely that the economies of large sections of the United States will be reduced to developing world status for long periods of time. Okay? And one of the reasons that will happen is, and this is a very important thing to bear in mind, the piece of technology that's most at threat from global warming is the very powerful human invention of the actuarial table. Okay? One of the smartest things that human beings ever came up with. It allows us to calculate risk in such a way that we can then afford to take it. And if you can't get insurance, if you can't calculate the risk, then no one ever can build anything, right? And the only problem with this great technology is it's utterly dependent on the world behaving in the future as it has behaved in the past. And if the world isn't going to behave like it is in the past, your actuarial table is useless. You can't underwrite anything anymore. That's the kind of thing that's at risk. So that's why the push in the next year or two, while we have this moment to try to do something that will bring down, because Governor Whitman's right, we're not stopping climate change, okay? But to try to bring down the top end of the possible outcomes, to try to reduce the chances of all-out catastrophe is what we've got to do. Once we do that, then we'll get to the work of figuring out how to live with the somewhat miserable stuff we've already bought into, all right? But that's job one.
One of the first things I would say that we have to do is to get a cap on carbon in this country, to put a price on carbon, which is going to cost us more, because it's going to cost us more in the different ways that we get our energy. There's just no question about it. And that's irrespective of whether it's coal, oil, gas, nuclear, or hydropower, wind power. It's going to cost us more. And that's a price that we're going to have to look at and we're going to have to pay. I don't believe we have much choice, because it's something that's coming at us from around the world. The wonderful thing about this country is that we do take some of these issues very seriously. Every one of the 50 states today has some kind of program relative to climate change. Everything from real demands of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions to benchmarking greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, here in the Northeast, you have RGGI, which is bringing together the states and doing a trading system. We need to establish that price for carbon, which is going to level the playing field. It is going to make it easier for companies. Right now, the reason we need a national standard is because companies cannot function to 50 different sets of standards. I mean, it just makes no sense, and they can't do it. So if we get our elected leaders to start thinking along the terms of how we are going to price carbon, I don't think it's going to be a carbon tax, although as many economists will argue, that's by far the most equitable and the easiest to get done. I don't see any appetite in Congress today for an additional tax per se, called a tax. A cap on carbon will increase price, and that will be de facto a tax of a sort. But it's the kind that I believe people will be willing to pay, because they need to get their energy, and we see a potential what's estimated as a 25% increase in electricity demand by 2030. We've got to think about how we're going to meet that and at the same time not trash our environment in the way we have in the past. Now that's going to pose enormous challenges for us, and it's going to be a difficult thing to get through, because coal is better than 50% of our power today. I don't see us walking away from it. That's not a partisan issue. That's a where do you come from issue, because it depends on who you represent and how they make their living, and how do we find a base power that just substitutes for that. We need and can do much better in conservation. We need and can do much better in renewables. I will throw out that I also think nuclear is 20% of our power today. I think we need to keep it there because it's the only form of base power that emits no greenhouse gases or other regulated pollutants when it's producing power. But all these are very difficult subjects. They're very controversial. They're very hard. But those are the kinds of steps we're going to have to start taking, and we're going to have to start taking them now.
So as you speak, you talked about Obama talking about reducing 80% by 2050. You've just talked about, the fact that there isn't a political appetite for a carbon tax. I have a picture of a speeding car that right now is going over the cliff at 100 miles an hour. And what we're talking about with these kinds of measures is going over the same cliff at 70 miles an hour. We're all going to be dead at the same time. So my question is this. We have seen in the last couple of weeks, the Pew Research Center came out with a poll saying climate change is at the bottom of the list of the concerns of Americans because the economic crisis has gotten their full attention. We have seen in the press, and I'm a member of the press, so I have to criticize my own profession here, and the member of the press has over and over again said either we spend money on the economy and the stimulus, or we spend money on dealing with climate change. What I would like to ask is, how are we going to tell people the hard truths of how much we have to change the way the economy is done? You wrote a book called Deep Economy, Bill, and that's a really important one. We need to shift, not just talk about 350.org. We need to talk about shifting fundamental ways in which this economy is in fact structured and need to change that kind of language. So that's my...
Well, the most important thing, let me just jump in quickly because I know Bill's going to have the full answer, but we got to break this mindset that it's either or. It is not either a healthy, thriving economy and or a clean and green environment. And that's the way we've looked at the environment for so long. We've said somebody has to lose if somebody else is going to win. You need both things. I mean, you just don't have a thriving economy if people don't have access to clean water, if they don't have clean air to breathe. And we need a thriving economy in order to be able to invest in the next generation of technology to protect the environment and to preserve open space. So we have to have those two things together. And you've heard a lot of discussion about green jobs and new green economy. It's real. There's all sorts of potential out there, but it's going to be very different, as you point out, from what we've seen in the past. You're not going to get your big General Motors type of new development. You're going to have small and mid-sized businesses created around different pockets of either new forms of energy or new kinds of environmental designs, and those are going to be the job creators of the future. And it's going to be a growth that we're, I think, going to see be significantly slower than what we're used to. But frankly, over the last 10, 15 years, we've had a growth that was basically unsustainable. I mean, it was off in the netherworld, and we've gotten very used to it. We've got to understand that it's not, we were doing okay before that. We really were doing all right. And getting back to that slower level of growth is not going to mean that we have lesser of a lifestyle than we've enjoyed in the past.
The world past cheap fossil fuel implies a million different things, okay? It's going to be a very different world because almost every feature of the world we inhabit is a function of the fact that for 200 years we've had access to cheap fossil fuel. That's why we built big sprawling suburbs. That's why the average bite of food you eat has traveled 2,000 miles to reach your lips. That's, in order to deal with climate change in the time that we have, which represents the greatest emergency we've ever had, okay, we can't one by one go fight each one of those battles and hope that it's over time adds up to what we're going to do. If you're looking for a strategy that has any chance of having effect, the one that Governor Whitman has outlined is correct. We need to dramatically affect the price of carbon energy, okay? And if that's what all that we're talking about, every part of this movement and fight leads in that same direction. It might be a tax, but it's more likely to be called a cap. Whatever it is, its effect will only happen if it raises the price of fossil energy enough that every single decision that gets made in the course of a day by individuals and by businesses is affected, And when that happens, if that day comes, if we can build that movement, and that's what 350 is about, if we can build that movement, then there will be many, many, many sequelae that flow from it. We'll wake up 10 years from now and the world would look very different. We'll have much more localized economies than we have at the moment because the transport of everything across enormous distances will make much less sense. We may well find ourselves moving out of some of the arch-consumerist mentality in which we've lived because that too is a function of this access to incredibly cheap energy that's allowed us to live wasteful and somewhat uninteresting lives in that regard. I've written a lot about food. I've written a lot about community. These are things that, these are my great loves, the places I want to spend my time, on farmers markets. The quickest way to get there is the same thing that we need to do to deal with climate change. If we can't raise the price of energy, fossil energy, dramatically, then none of it will happen on any real scale. And we can't raise the price of fossil energy dramatically without building a worldwide movement soon to let it happen. That's why I leave my place that I like to be in Vermont and come to other places that are very pretty, like here, and I quite enjoy. But really, I'd rather be home in Vermont. But at the other end of Robert Frost's, peregrinations. But that's what we need to do now. That's the task that unites these various things.
There is a group now in Belchertown that is keeping the name Step It Up for the environment, and that is working pretty much around the idea of biochar. What can be done to help to produce charcoal that would be buried in the soil, and then that has two good effects. One is that it sequesters the carbon because the waste from plants is used to make the charcoal. And also, it's not a fertilizer, but it helps to retain the water and the nutrients in the soil. This has been discovered many, many years ago. Amazon people used it. And it is also being used in many countries in Japan, but it's not very well known in the United States yet. But I do think it is one important way that we can go carbon negative. And I hope that this will be a part of the large movement that you are talking about, Bill.
Yes, amen. Biochar, terra preta, black earth, very cool stuff. In fact, I just finished writing a piece that'll be in the next issue of Orion about biochar and trying to spread the word. It's one of a handful of really interesting sort of out of the box technological solutions, low tech solutions that give us some hope. It's not going. The thing to remember about this crisis is there are no silver bullet solutions, nothing that we just do and it takes care of it and we go back to doing what we were doing before and, can stop worrying. But it's definitely one of the most interesting things that's happened in the last couple of years is the sort of spate of interest about it. The guy who's I think done the most around the world to spread it is probably my friend Tim Flannery from Australia, the great writer and scientist, and he's been talking about it a lot with real effect. And I think we'll see maybe at Copenhagen some more. So on October 24th in Belchertown, okay, get a lot of black earth. Try and make a big 350 up on a hillside that everybody can see, okay, or something like that.
Let me just say something to that, because it brings up something that I think is terribly important that we remember in this discussion, that the ingenuity in this country and around the world is extraordinary if given the right set of incentives. And we need to do that, because the answer is not going to be any one silver bullet. It's going to be a whole host of these. And we need to encourage them. And we have to be careful when we put pressure on government to act, that government doesn't overact and cause more trouble than they're solving. And I would just point to corn-based ethanol as an example. What we should have done is said we want renewable energy, and let the marketplace figure out which sort of renewable or clean, however they wanted to phrase it, which was going to work, which made sense. Instead, they decided we want clean energy, we want renewable energy, and oh, by the way, it's got to be corn-based ethanol. And all of a sudden we discover, guess what? If the feedstock is now not going to the cows and the pigs and the chickens, and it's going into the cars, you have a problem. And it's reflected in our grocery stores, it's reflected around the world in food prices and the problems that we have there. And oh, by the way, it's a 90-to-1 ratio anyway. It's 10% of corn-based ethanol to 90% gasoline to burn efficiently, and even then it doesn't burn terribly efficiently in the cars. So we want to make sure, while we want government to set the parameters, we want to make very sure we keep government from trying to proscribe exactly how we address these issues, so we can have things like biochar, these are going to be the answers and solutions in different parts of the world and different communities, even within the United States, and we need to allow that flexibility and that ingenuity to occur.
You have both spoken strongly and clearly about the dire consequences of inaction. I'm wondering, what do you think is the role of positive vision, or some sort of unifying positive theme towards creating this global movement, towards moving towards a higher price of carbon? And along with that, what do you say to the potential short-term negative effects of a higher price on carbon that will negatively affect people of color on racial and class lines?
The justice dimensions of this question are one of the things that make it hardest, okay? And while the effect may fall somewhat in this country along class or racial lines, the 1,000 times larger instance of that is what it means around the world, okay? Where there are billions of people without access to any of the things that we want, and for whom the cheapest and easiest way to get them is to burn the coal that they have at hand, and to tell them that they're not going to get to do that is unbelievably difficult, okay? And conversely, they're the same people who are going to be damaged first by and already being damaged by the spread of climate change. That's the hardest part of these international negotiations, of many hard parts. And it's one of the things, that's one of the reasons why, we're working all over the world, and we have great people all over the world trying very hard to bring the world together around one particular vision. And that 350 is both a negative and a positive one. You know, it's very much, if we stay over it, there's a lot of bad things going to happen. On the other hand, it could conceivably be the engine for building a world much fairer than the one we live in now. As we go into negotiations like Copenhagen, the poor world, for the first time in international negotiations ever, arrives with some leverage, okay? You know, when they talk about world trade or anything, they're just begging for help from us. But this time, if they decide not to participate, if they keep burning, well, nothing we can do in this country to slow down the rate at which global warming is going if we don't get some participation from China and India, whatever. So they're in a position, both practical and moral, since we're by far the biggest cause of the problem historically, to demand from us some real justice. Some carbon version of the Marshall Plan is clearly called for, okay? The transfer of some resources in the form of technology north to south is what needs to happen. It's harder all the time. The fact that, of the many reasons to be upset that the country was left in broken shape by the last president, one of them is that we don't have the money to do this most important of tasks right now, or it's not as easily to be found as it would have been some years ago, okay? We need some resources to be able to transfer north to south. And there's no more important task, and it's one of the things that's going to make this thing hardest. It's why we need to build pressure all around the world for a same kind of solution and hope that we can figure it out. That's going to be the hardest part.
Just to back that up, the very first G8 meeting that I went to when I became administrator of the EPA in Trieste, the developing countries, none of them had signed on to Kyoto. And what they said was, in looking at the developed countries, they said, we really think this is a plot. It's a plot on your part to keep our economies from growing because you did all this, you burned these fossil fuels to get your economies to where they are today. And this is just something on your part. You've made it up and you just don't want us to thrive. So there's an enormous challenge to get them to take the next steps. The other side of it is they are also probably going to be the earliest and the most adversely affected by doing nothing. Because where we're going to see the droughts, the lack of food production is going to come in those developed countries, in those developing countries, we're going to have, even though we may not have the resources we've had before, we're going to have enough resources to be able to pull ourselves along for a lot longer than some of those developing countries. And they're beginning to understand that now and coming to the table, as Bill said, with a little bit of leverage that they perhaps didn't have before. But it's going to be a big challenge. The other part, though, of what you said is what can happen from action. It's enormous. There's no stopping it. If people get together and really put pressure on those who are representing them to take action, it will have an impact. I mean, even today in this country, if an elected representative doesn't answer their own phone and doesn't read all their own mail, they have somebody who does. And they have somebody who's telling them what's on the mind of their constituents. And it may not totally change their opinion, but it does affect how they prioritize, and it may change their opinion entirely. And Bill tells a wonderful story of a candidate who changed herself on this issue rather dramatically. I used the example earlier today to show how it does happen, how you can make a difference, of the Terri Schiavo case. And the fact that while there was enormous controversy and nobody won on that, the people who felt that disconnecting her was murder were absolutely focused on delivering that message to Congress. And they flooded the telephones, the emails, they wrote letters, to the point where it was an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote that voted for federal government intervention. And you had moderate pro-choice Democrats who voted for that because they said, that's what our constituents want, that's what we're hearing, that's what we need. And in fact, Susan Collins from Maine was one who voted against it. And she thought, I'm going to get killed. I'm going to get absolutely killed when I get home because that's all, but I can't in good conscience vote for this intervention. Well, the day after the bill was signed by the president, depending on the poll, you saw that either 75% or 80% of the American people said the Congress should not have intervened at that stage. That wasn't their role. So if you flip that on its head, that means 25% of the American people were able to get Congress to act in 3 days and a president to cut a vacation short to come back and sign something. And it wasn't that those people who thought Congress shouldn't act weren't passionate. It's just they were passionate around their dinner table and with their television set or car radio. And they don't vote. But the people who really wanted to make a difference, they communicated their desire to the Hill, and it made a difference. So the ability to affect policy is very real, and it really is in the hands of the American people. And finally, in this election cycle was the first time we really stood up and voted in proper numbers. The average voter turnout up until this year in a primary was 10% in the United States. In a congressional election, the voter turnout average was 35%, and we really thought we'd done well when we got to 51% in a presidential. Now, that finally changed. I just hope the American people aren't going to say, okay, we've done the job, we've got the new change in there, it's all going to happen, and we're going back to just worrying about how we're going to put bread on the table and forget that they still need to be there and be partners and nudgers to get things done.
Thank you for letting me speak. I'm a believer that the world, from the way I see it, we're coming out of a mini ice age. A lot of people don't like to say this. This is my personal take. I'd like your take on it. Even if we had not emitted any methane or CO2 into the atmosphere, I think we're going to have a slight warming of the planet as it was. And I think that our emissions of greenhouse gases have just accelerated that process, that we were coming out of a mini ice age. what I'm saying is we all know we've put a layer of insulation around the planet, and I believe in carbon negative. I wonder what your take is on global dimming as a means of cooling the planet. Some people propose like a 1 or a 1.8% reduction in the amount of radiation reaching the Earth, and that would be a means of bringing us down to a cooler point. And the other question, I'd like to give you a handout before you leave, but what's your take on global dimming as well as carbon negative as a means of helping?
Are you talking about using geoengineering to reduce the amount of sunlight striking the Earth?
Sure, yes.
Is that yeah. You know, there are, even 4 or 5 years ago, we would have said that that there's this series of proposals that people at one point or another have come up with to how we would cool the Earth, you know, and at one point people wanted to float white styrofoam chips on all the oceans so they would bounce more sunlight back out. The one that people talk about most now is putting a lot of sulfur into the upper atmosphere, flying constant barrage of airplanes up. So you'd have kind of permanent acid rain. The sky would turn maybe a kind of milky white, but it would reduce some of the incoming solar. Well, you know what? We used to say that these were insane. And in fact, they still are insane at some basic level, okay? But it certainly helps us understand just how much tinkering and monkeying around with the system we've already done that, you know, scientists are now at least beginning to try to figure out. I mean, they don't even really actually seem possible. But it certainly reminds us that we have taken a system and monkeyed around with it in remarkable ways. And you have to understand how out of balance things are, okay? The Holocene, you know, through mini ice, through all those sort of things, you know, the temperature of the Earth didn't wobble more than a degree either side of 59 degrees Fahrenheit, you know, for 10,000 years. That's the human era, okay? Not more than a degree for 10,000 years. The consensus, mainstream, not at all dramatic consensus estimate for what we're going to see this century without really rapid, really dramatic action is, we've already raised temperature 1 degree. We'll see another 5 or 6 degrees Fahrenheit in the course of this century. So, I mean, we're talking about stuff that dwarfs anything that, you know, on the heat side that nature has done at least for, you know, several hundred million years, you know, and with a kind of speed that we never see, and with the potential for just this sort of endless acceleration. That's why, and of course, the thing that makes it so politically hard, the reason that you guys who know about this have to take some action, political action, is that it doesn't, the damage comes well after the cause, okay? It's not like you hit your hammer on your thumb and you feel pain. It's like you hit your hammer on your thumb and 3 years later you go, oh crap, you know? You know, there's a thermal lag as oceans soak up heat, and it means that, you know, we don't have, if we wait until we can see more, I mean, we already can see, as I told you, lots and lots of the effects, but if we keep waiting to see more and more of them, we're well past the point where we can do anything about it. You know, we're in our last good shot right now, so we should take it. And I should add, before I forget, for those who can't get, you know, enough of talk about global warming, someone pointed out that there's a national teach-in tomorrow. There'll be something going on at UMass at the Campus Center, Room 101, with a lot of good talk. All I want to say to that is I know and love all the people who are doing the teach-in nationally, and I'm sure this will be great, and I hope you go. But you know what? The point, at least, of my visit here today is not to be thought-provoking. Okay? All I want to be is action-provoking. And if there's not something big that happens next October 24th here, then, you know, my visit was clearly a failure, but that's, you know, that's what we need to start have happening. Less chat about all this and actually some real involvement. And when people did it with, you know, Step It Up and things, it really helped. And so I hope you'll try it again.
Thank you. You both spoke a lot about action, and I understand that climate change, is a really large issue, and so we're looking at a lot of action on a large scale. But I was hoping you could speak more to individual, everyday actions here in the Pioneer Valley that all of us can take that is really could make a difference.
Take a look at what your carbon footprint is. How are you living your life, and are there things that you can do? Everything from changing the light bulbs to encouraging that your county or municipal office buildings are insulated in the best way possible, or using combined heat and power where they can, or using solar, are making the effort to ensure that they're doing everything they can, that the local businesses are encouraging things like working from home 1 day a week, carpooling. Those things, they all seem little, but they do add up, and they do make a difference over time, and they're part of what we can do. How many of you unplug your charger after you finish charging your cell phone or your iPod? How many of you leave the water running when you're brushing your teeth instead of turning it off? Again, little things, but they all add up and make a huge difference. On a subject just a little away from climate change, but related to the environment, to give you a sense of how big individual action can be. I think most of you here will remember the Exxon Valdez spill, which still remains our single largest environmental disaster, the single largest. Well, every 8 months, as much oil is deposited along the coastline United States from non-point source pollution, the kind of stuff that we do when we leave a leaky oil pan in our car, or we change the oil and dump it down the drain. Every 8 months, as much oil from that kind of activity is deposited along the coastline of the United States as was released during that Exxon Valdez spill. Now, if that doesn't tell you that our individual cumulative actions don't have an impact, I don't think anything will. They do, and the way to get started again is to look around, start with your home, then go to because buildings are the largest source, largest cause, not source, but cause of greenhouse gases. Look at how you're living your life, how the people around you are, how your community is, what kinds of things are you doing, what's happening for smart growth. Is your town encouraging redevelopment of the town center? Is it making it easier for people to work and live in the same place? It's when they're doing planning, are they putting bike trails in along with road redevelopment? Rail to trail, if you're not using the rail lines anymore, you're turning them into bike trails so people can actually bike to work, perhaps, instead of always taking the car. There are a lot of those small individual actions, but then it would be to join the bigger action. And I'll throw it here over to Bill, because it's being part of that bigger thing. Again, reaching out to your friends and neighbors and say, hey, have you heard of the 350? Do you understand this? Get involved.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, there are lots and lots of things that we can do and should be doing. I mean, we could eat lower on the food chain and make sure that the food we eat, including what meat we're going to eat, we're buying locally, okay? That sort of thing. The only point I've been trying to make is not that these things are not important. They are very important, and I've spent much of my life doing them and writing about them. And, I have the most prize for having the most energy efficient house in the state of Vermont. I believe in them completely. But don't do them for all kinds of reasons, but don't do them with the hope that by doing them you'll materially affect the rate at which carbon is entering the atmosphere, okay? The only way that we have to do that in the time that we have available to us is to make political change from the top that then filters down to every decision that everybody makes, even if they're not among the 5% of people who are really actively concerned about global warming, so that they involve everybody. So do all those things, but save some energy for politics, for this deep involvement in this kind of movement. It's the same, it's like during the civil rights movement, okay? People went out and, sat in at lunch counters, right? And part of what they wanted was to be able to eat at that lunch counter, okay? But mostly what they wanted was to make the point that every lunch counter all around the South they couldn't eat at, It was a vehicle, a way of making that larger point. And we have to make, and if excuse me for being repetitive and excuse me for sounding overly urgent, because I know that it's sort of wearying at some level and seems hectoring and harassing, and I don't even like the part of me that does it very much, but it's what's so much in my heart, partly because unlike other movements for social change, this one comes with a time limit, okay? The people who were in the civil rights movement had to be way braver than we are. No one's going to blow up your church for talking about climate change, okay? But they had the great luxury of knowing that they were going to win in the end, Martin Luther King, that great sermon he gave the night before he was shot, was all about, I have been to the mountaintop, I have seen the promised land, I may not get there with you, but you will get there. He said at the end of every speech, he said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, a trope, in fact, that Obama picked up in his inaugural in a quite beautiful way. The arc of the moral universe is long, it bends toward justice, we will get there. Well, the arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat. And if we don't solve this soon, we will not solve it. It's not gonna happen eventually. It's either gonna happen in the next few years, or it's not gonna happen. That's how the physics and chemistry of it work. And that's why it just feels to me so incredibly urgent to be out doing this work now.
Quick question for Bill, and then also one for Governor Whitman. For Bill, we're in a chapel. Could you say a few words about religion, both positively around 350.org, but also negatively in that you have the religious right in this country that just forced the resignation of Rich Cizik, who's one of the most important advocates of putting climate change before more conservative religious congregations around the country. That was a win for the religious right. They'd been gunning for him for years. You say a few words about that, but I think the governor bears a particular burden that we don't bear in this state, which is that of Republicans. And I say that not only because of differences in policy prescription, what to do and questions around legislation, but fundamental questions about what one sees in the world. Public opinion, as has been raised, is really dramatic about this. It shows that about 2/3 of registered Democrats, between 2/3 and 3/4, see climate change as a huge problem that is mostly caused by human beings and that something can and ought to be done about by the government. 2/3 of Republicans don't believe it's a problem, don't believe it exists, or believe that that government can do nothing about it, and this is just a plot to promote socialism. So religion and the particular burden of being a Republican.
Okay, I'll take religion first to give her time to sort of prepare for... Look, faith communities are going to be very important in this fight, and that's starting to happen. One of the tactics that we tried out here in Massachusetts in the fall as a sort of test for next October that went very well was having lots and lots of churches agree to ring their bells 350 times. We did it mostly in eastern Massachusetts, some out here, very effective. We want that to happen in every congregation we can find around the world and across faiths to the degree that we can figure out other sort of ways to do it. And we've had great involvement from huge numbers of Buddhists in Ladakh, and we have big movement now going in the Arab Middle East, which is extremely interesting and exciting. Okay, the role of, and one of the best parts of that is that increasingly, especially among young people, that desire for environmental action extends into evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity. Okay, there are people fighting rearguard actions. We're never going to win over the Pat Robertsons of the world, but it doesn't matter. I was off at Oklahoma Christian University not long ago, and it's a red place in a red state, and the next day the kids there went up in the chapel and rang the bell 350 times, and I hope it made Jim Inhofe's ears hurt, just to hear that. But it's that involvement is really important. Youth groups and faith groups are two of the most important components of this fight we're putting together right now. And nothing could be, because basically what we're involved in, as I tried to explain with that list, we're involved. The argument over between different wings of the religious community is minor by comparison. Like worrying about whether or not we were, the product of creation or evolution, okay, is an interesting discussion. But the thing that we can agree on is, no matter where we think we came from, that we are busily engaged in the process of decreation right now, okay? And hence we have something to work on, not something to divide us. And we try very hard on that, and I think it's starting to work.
Well, frankly, I've never felt it a burden to be a Republican, at least not my kind of Republican, and the party I grew up in. And I've never felt it was my duty to defend Jim Inhofe either. We just don't agree, and
not possible.
No, it's not possible. But he keeps getting reelected, so there's some people out there who really, really like him. I look back and I say, as I said earlier, the first time we ever put land aside for public use was Yosemite, and that was Abraham Lincoln. That Teddy Roosevelt's the one who started the national park system, really got it up and going. That it was in fact Richard Nixon who signed the laws establishing the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. And in fact, if you look at that period between 1970 and 1990, when most of our laws and regulations were established to protect our environment, it was Republican presidents signing legislation and working with the Democrat Congress. So it's been bipartisan. And there are very strong environmentalists within the Republican Party. I would caution you not to look on Washington as being representative of all Republicans, the Republicans in Washington, nor the ones when pollsters go to poll Republicans, they tend to go to the base. The base as it has been defined recently. The base as it has been defined recently is frankly a lot more conservative than most Republicans. And I say that with some justification because the emphasis in the last campaign to get the base out to vote worked. There were 1.8 million more self-identified Christian conservatives who voted in this election than voted 4 years ago for President Bush. And we got our clocks cleaned. So while it's very nice to say that you want to get your base out, there ain't enough of them, if you're a Republican, to be a national party. There just aren't. You have concentrations where there are a lot, and you'll have concentrations like Oklahoma where you'll get people like Jim Inhofe who doesn't believe in it, and yet, as Bill said, you can go to the university there and go to a college there, and you can get strong support. So I would just caution people not to worry about the labels too much and rather talk to the individuals and see where they are, because you're going to find a big variety within the party as well as amongst people just in general.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I just have a quick question about nuclear power, nuclear energy. Basically, from my understanding, the world's energy demands are growing in developed and developing countries. Coal and fossil fuels provide the world with around 85% of its energy demands. We keep talking about how we're going to run out of time and how we're working on a short time frame. I've also come under the understanding that renewable energies may not be sufficient enough to provide us for our energy demands, and I just want to know how feasible you think it is to implement more nuclear power in our energy plan right now.
Well, I have to start with a disclaimer because I co-chair something called CASE Energy, Clean Safe Energy. CleanSafeEnergy.org is the website with Dr. Patrick Moore, who was one of the co-founders of Greenpeace. And the purpose of CASE is to get individuals and groups to join as a grassroots effort to get out information about nuclear power and where it is, 1 out of every 5 homes and businesses today in our country gets its power through nuclear. It's 20% of our power. Although the interesting thing is 20% of that 20% comes from nuclear warheads from Russia that we are reprocessing and turning into something good in this country. I believe we ought to keep it at 20%. because as I mentioned earlier, it's the only form of base power that does not emit greenhouse gases or other regulated pollutants while it's producing power. Everything, transportation and mining, yes, you're going to get emissions, but you do that with every source. It's also, there was a study out today, it's the nuclear reactors that we have in this country are running at 91% efficiency. And it is on a per kilowatt basis, once it's up and running, one of the cheapest forms of power that we have on a per kilowatt basis. They're very expensive to build. However, once they're up and running, they're very efficient. I see there's a lot more sentiment. The latest studies that were done show that better than 50% of the American people are willing to talk about nuclear now and think of it as a part of their future. The very interesting thing is once you educate them a little bit about the history of safety, you look around the world at France, it's 80% nuclear, and what they have done and what they're doing with reprocessing, the numbers shoot up pretty quickly to somewhere around 70%. And the highest support for nuclear comes in those communities, and again, a study done of those communities around nuclear facilities, and the study was done excluding people who worked at the facilities. The jobs there are good. It's part of, you look at the economic issues that we face today, and construction can take up to 3,000 people at a time to do construction of a reactor, but it's anywhere from 500 to 700 full-time employees with an average salary that's about 30% above what's normal for that particular area. So they throw off good money as well. Again, no silver bullet. Not the only answer, but if I look at China, I would rather have China bring on 1 or 2 nuclears over the next year than 1 new coal-fired power plant a month, as they are currently doing.
Yeah, it's very clear that the risk profile of, we think differently about risk in relation to nuclear power than we did a little while ago. Not necessarily because it's gotten much safer. It's still pretty dangerous. If something goes wrong, it goes really wrong, and it's not good. On the other hand, a new coal-fired power plant operated exactly the way it's supposed to carries not a risk but a guarantee of something going wrong. Okay, so it's the relative weighting. What I worry about one of the things that I worry about a lot with nuclear power is the opportunity risk, okay? They're very expensive to build and they take a while. And hence, the resources that we may need in other places will be soaked up by nuclear. Now, I've said before that I think the essential job we have to do, by far the most important job we have to do, is not picking technologies. It's creating the conditions with a high, stiff price on carbon for what comes afterwards. And if markets then shift towards nuclear power, then okay. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the only way that would happen is with a real government subsidy for it. And I think Governor Whitman was exactly right when she said before that what we want to tell Congress is we want Congress not to tell us we want corn-based ethanol. We want Congress to tell us clean, renewable energy. If in a battle of just market economics, it turns out that left on its own, nuclear power is part of the solution, I think it's going to be a very small part of the solution, I got to say. And I think it reminds us, the latest econometric modeling I've seen, studies a couple of weeks old, indicate that it's by an order of magnitude, a factor of 10, more expensive than what the first important job is, which is conservation and efficiency within all the things we have at the moment, okay? That's where the real energy potential is to be found. It's in the amount of stuff that we waste, and it's going to be, that's going to be cheaper for a very, very long time than nuclear power is going to be. So I don't spend a lot of time worrying about it one way or another. I think left to its own devices, the market's not going to do much of it, is my guess.
I want to thank both Governor Whitman and Bill McKibben for a wonderful and stimulating couple of days here at Amherst College. I'm sorry that you all couldn't have participated and shared in it all, but certainly you've gotten a flavor for the passion and the insight and the careful calculation that these two distinguished people have shared with us
And when we leave, I hope we have to leave, but I hope that you will talk amongst yourselves and figure out who's going to be, doing what for next October 24th. Thank you all very much.